Often when we read the New Testament, especially if we've been a Christian for a long time or we grew up in the faith, it loses its mystery and wonder sometimes because of our overfamiliarity with the Bible. So
Yeah.
some of the work I try to do, whether it's Strange Religion or I have a book called 15 New Testament Words of Life, is I want to talk about the Bible in such a way that it still captures that wonder.
Welcome to the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Bryant. In every episode, we bring in guests who will inspire, encourage you to be more effective in your mission field. Well, on today's episode, I have with me Dr. Nijay Gupta. How are you doing, Nijay?
I'm doing well. Had a sabbatical recently. I'm all rested and excited to chat.
Rested and ready to go. Well, I'm just honored to have an academic professor, theologian who's an expert in all things Paul. And I feel like as church leaders who listen to this, obviously so much of what we do is motivated by the New Testament and by the work of Paul. We like to think of ourselves as church planners like him, perhaps. But as someone who's training up the future church leaders and someone who's spent your life in the work of Paul, where do you think some of the things that we too often miss might be when it comes to living out this new kingdom life?
Gosh, what a great question, but a big question. And this kind of goes with my work on strange religions, some of the other things I'm doing. Often when we read the New Testament, especially if we've been a Christian for a long time or we grew up in the faith, it loses its mystery and wonder sometimes because of our overfamiliarity with the Bible. So some of the work I try to do, whether it's Strange Religion or I have a book called 15 New Testament Words of Life, is I want to talk about the Bible in such a way that it still captures that wonder. So think about going to Disney World with your kids. And I've been to Disney World, 7, 8, 9 times probably. But that first time when your kids go, just they're looking around like eyes big, and it's just this paradise on earth, and you've never seen anything like it before. And I just wish it could be like that for us when we read the Bible, because that is what God's word is. It is this amazing world we step into. One of the best illustrations for this is C.S. Lewis's idea of Narnia, where you can step through the wardrobe into this amazing, fanciful place of miracles and talking animals and all kinds of stuff. But you don't stay in that place. You step back into the human world with your mind filled with all the possibilities of Narnia.
Wow.
And what I really want is for when people read the Bible, you don't stay there, right? You step away from the Bible again to make dinner or to go to work or to go to your kid's sporting event or to go to school. And yet you have that imagination filled with anything is possible in this world. We can conquer any problem by
Mm.
God's help. We could turn things right side up.
I love that. Well, and as someone who's an expert on that time period and that world in which we step into, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about strange religion. It's really an exploration of how truly radical, weird, unusual this new group of Christ followers were in their day and age. Tell us a few of the insights you share in the book.
Yeah, this book really comes out of some discontent, I feel, complacency, that the modern church has, maybe stagnancy. When you have a stagnant body of water, you're going to get putrid things. You're going to get flies and fleas. You're going to, it's going to die. I just felt like I wanted to give pastors, Christians, Christian leaders a jolt to inspire them from our spiritual ancestors. So really behind the book is a question I don't really ask in the book, but it's really behind the book, is would our spiritual ancestors, the first Christians, recognize us today as their true descendants? Are we recognizable as the people of Jesus Christ? And sadly, I think mostly they would say no. And I'm hoping my book is a kind of wake up call to that. I don't demean modern Christians in the book.
Sure.
It's not a finger wagging kind of book. What I really wanted to do is take us in a time machine and go back in time 2,000 years to walk with the early Christians in the pioneering days of the first church, One thing I'm amazed by, Eric, is how radical, how backwards these first Christians were to take these huge steps of faith and to experience dire consequences for going against the grain of Roman society. Sometimes we talk about persecution today, like, my history teacher said some negative things about Christians, or, oh, people on the internet are saying this and that. And we joke about that as like first quote, hashtag first world problems, first world persecution. But it is true. People literally died for following Jesus in that early period. And the blood of the martyrs, is the lifeblood, is the seed for the saints. So I really wanted to take people back to that world. So I'm from Ohio. I'm a Buckeye, born and raised, and I grew up in a very Christian atmosphere. There were two stations on the radio, Christian country and Christian evangelical. That was it. That's what you listened to. There's a little bit of news, but that was pretty much it. Pastors were beloved and respected. There was like an open invitation for clergy to go to Cleveland Indian games for free.
Wow.
This is the heyday of evangelicalism, I feel like. And the first Christians didn't have those privileges. They didn't have those rights. So what my book does is show that the message of Jesus was a threat to Roman order, was a threat to Roman society, the very heart of Roman society. So I'll just give a little bit and you can
Yeah.
follow up with
Yeah.
this. Roman society was built on what I call the Great Pyramid of Power. So think about this pyramid, and at the very top are the beings and the people with the greatest amount of power. So at the very top is going to be Jupiter, best and greatest, right? The Roman version of Zeus, and the Olympians. And then below that, you have demigods, if you've followed Percy Jackson and all of that. Below that, you have the emperor who stands at the cusp of heaven and earth. The Roman emperor was called the Pontifex Maximus, the great bridge builder between heaven and earth. Below that, on the human scale, you have the senatorial class, equestrian class, elite humans, top 1%, we would say. And then the majority of humans would be in the common class. They would be plebeians, and they live what we call subsistence level, hand to mouth. And then below that, you at the very bottom of society, you have slaves, criminals, foreigners, immigrants, so forth. And everybody at the bottom wanted to go up in the ladder or looked up to the people on the ladder of success. And at the top, you have these Roman gods. And the whole fabric of society was built on respecting and honoring these gods. To obey them, you want to give them the rituals they deserve, because if not, hell's going to break loose. The
Mm-hmm.
fabric of society is going to collapse, and these gods are going to break out with wrath. In come the Christians, and they actually throw a huge axe at the whole system, the whole tree,
Yeah.
the whole paradigm. And they say, God is not this tyrant who's at the top of the pyramid forcing the people at the bottom into slavery and obedience. God is a loving father. God would give his life for you. That's how much he loves you. And this would have been seen as extremely dangerous to the people in power. They don't want a regime change.
Yeah.
This would have been very weird to most people. What kind of God is this that talks about love so much? And yet, this would have been compelling, beautiful, and attractive to so many people that just didn't feel like they had a place in the Roman world.
Yeah. Well, and you have the Caesar cults, and Paul's going to some of these towns where they worship Caesar is Lord, is what they would say. And instead, they're
Yeah,
saying
yeah,
Jesus is Lord, And then if
yeah.
something bad happens, it's got to be the Christians' fault because they're not worshiping our gods. Like, it's revolutionary in many ways, obviously, what was going on there. And it started from the bottom. It was welcoming the immigrants and the slave. And it's just such a beautiful picture of what we could be and what we should be. I know you're not wagging your finger, but I do want to hear for just a moment, what are some of the ways where we have become more like our culture, not in a becoming like the Romans to reach the Romans kind of way, but where we have taken on certain elements of our culture that actually aren't biblical, that actually aren't helping us advance this new kingdom. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, one way to ask that question is if you could transport the Apostle Paul to our time and just take him on a tour of the United States. I've lived in Seattle, I've lived in Philadelphia, I've lived in Boston, I've lived in Cleveland, I live in Portland, Oregon now. I've lived in upstate New York, I've lived in England, I've lived all over the place. I've been everywhere, as they say. And so I feel like I have a good sense of what the evangelical church looks like. And I'm not trying to pick on the evangelicals. I'm just saying they're my people. So I have a special concern for them.
Yes.
What would the Apostle Paul say? Well, one of my favorite theologians is N.T. Wright, a prolific scholar, man of the church, bishop, former bishop. And he's actually answered this question. And it wouldn't be the first thing I'd say, but it's really important. He says the first thing that Paul would notice is that we Christians are not unified and we don't care. So he'd say we actually relish in hating other Christians because, hey, I'm Presbyterian and you're Baptist, or hey, I'm Catholic and you're not, or hey, I'm Pentecostal and you are Greek Orthodox. We are so quick to judge, demean, talk down to others who are all in for Jesus.
Right. Our
And
brothers, our sisters. Yeah.
the dangers of that. One of the things that historians say is really remarkable about early Christianity is how unified they were across the whole Roman world when they didn't have telephones, the internet. They didn't have modern ways of communicating. So how could they have been so unified? Think about Paul writing from to places like Rome and then to places much further away like Ephesus. Similar messages. Ephesians and Romans are very, very similar. Galatians, also very, very similar. Crete, the island of Crete that Titus is on. Again, how could they have communicated so much about what is right and true and good in terms of doctrine, in terms of ethics, in terms of truth, across such a vast space that would take you weeks, sometimes months to travel. And so they could get on the same page, so to speak. It wasn't perfect. And I'm very clear in the book. I have a whole chapter on how the early Christians weren't perfect, but how today we're so quick to judge. That would be one. I'd say another biggie is wealth and greed. I'm writing a follow-up. You're one of the first people to know this, by the way.
Come on, tell us.
I'm writing a sequel to Strange Religion. I haven't come up with a title right now, but it's called, my working title is World Right Side Up.
Hmm.
And the idea is, I didn't really talk about the modern church much in Strange Religion, but I do talk a lot about in this follow-up. One of my chapters is called Crazy Rich Christians.
Hmm.
And the idea that you could be a pastor and ask your church to put up $86 million so you could fly in a private luxury jet around the world and around the country to do ministry. I think Paul would be horrified by this. He would be absolutely horrified by wealthy Christians. Now, I do think there were wealthy Christians at that time, but it would be an extreme minority, and there would be a humongous obligation on them to be excessively generous.
Sure. Yeah.
When you have house churches in the ancient world in Corinth or Rome or Ephesus, they were probably wealthier Christians that were putting their home to use for ministry. And the idea that today Christians would seek to gain wealth for the sake of being excessively wealthy, it'd be atrocious to Jesus. It would be atrocious to Paul. Unfathomable. Now, I don't think that they recommended a specific salary, but I don't know if you heard the story before, but one of my heroes is Rich Mullins. You could tell when I grew up based on the
Yes.
fact that maybe some of your listeners won't know who Rich Mullins is, but he was
You
a
and
singer-songwriter in the
I
80s,
get you.
90s.
Yes.
We get each other. And he was singer-songwriter, became very popular. He was making good money. And he started to be convicted by this and feel that this is not right. So he actually told his manager, his agent, he said, whatever money I get, set it aside before it gets to me and only give me the salary equivalent to a high school teacher with my work experience,
Wow.
and give everything else away to charity. I think that was more like the impulse of the early Christians who talked a lot about money. They talked a lot about money. We say, I can't talk about money in church. That's not appropriate. Read James. Read the book of James. Just actually literally read it out loud in church one day and see what
Mm,
happens to what
yeah.
people think when you read it in like a translation they'll understand, like the Message Bible or a New Living Translation. And I wouldn't be surprised if people walk out because it's really convicting. So unity, I think, would be one. Excessive wealth would be another. I think just the radical nature of discipleship, and this is kind
Mm,
of the spirit of the book,
mm,
is I get this from John Stott, one of my favorite Christian writers. I get this from Dallas Willard. Nowadays, people like John Mark Comer, one of my favorite people, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Every day, Christians have to wake up, look in the mirror, and say, Jesus, how can I follow you
mm,
rather than following the ways of the world? Not everything in the world is bad,
yeah.
but often we just go into autopilot and we don't think through. And what made the early Christians true followers of Jesus in their best moments is they only marched to the beat of Jesus and the Spirit. They didn't march to the beat of just the status quo. When I
Hmm.
read the New Testament, I'm just blown away by the crazy things going on in the book of Acts.
Mm,
It's because they discerned, what does the Spirit want each and every moment, and not, how can I just not be in trouble today?
yeah.
I think one thing my church is doing, which I really love, is they're encouraging everybody in the church, youth, children, adults, to meditate on the Psalm 23 every morning, pray the Lord's Prayer every midday, and do a prayer of examination in the evening, and invite God into a process of reflection on your day. Where did I see God? Where did I disobey God? And where do I lament at brokenness in myself and in others? I tell you what, if you do that every day, you're going to start to live differently in the ways
Yeah.
that the early Christians live, or something like that, because I
Yeah.
think it's easy to get lulled into just zombie mode. Whenever my
Hmm.
kids are like just on social media and they can't stop, I call it zombie scrolling.
Yes.
So we get into zombie mode when we're
Yeah.
just going through our day, and we don't, and our priorities get taken away from
Mm.
just saying, Christ, what do you want me to do? I know I'm talking a lot here. I want you to engage more, but
Yeah. No, this
I
is
remember
great.
hearing stories about Craig Keener. I'm sure you know who that is, but he's a New Testament scholar, someone I admire very much. And there's all these great stories about him because he's just a passionate Pentecostal. And I heard stories from when he was in college. And I hope, Craig, you're listening. Please correct me if I got any of this wrong. He was so full of the Spirit that people come to him, knock on his dorm door, and say, "Hey, we're going out to get some McDonald's or whatever." And he would say, "Can I have a moment?" They're like, "Why?" And he says, "I need to pray about it." He would literally pray about everything. And if we were in that mindset, "Hey, you want to go for a walk? Let me pray about it." Just always checking in with Jesus, always checking in with the Spirit, always saying, "Is this good, right, true, and beautiful?" Gosh, wouldn't we live more like
We though.
our
Yeah.
ancestors?
So beautiful. Well, I think so much of what you write really does, I think, help right size our way of seeing the world and how we live out this faith. We'll be giving away some of your books for free to those who are signed up for my email newsletter at ericbryant.org. You also write a story or a book, Tell Her Story. I think part of what really is amazing about that early church, we kind of zombie mode, Jew and Gentile, that's an enormous deal. Women leading is an enormous deal. Like this was truly a revolution going on, and it took over the world, the known world. And so, yeah, just what other thought about, how engaged people from different classes were and women were? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of the book is the notion of the inherent dignity of every single person. There were certain things going on in culture. When we look back to like Nazi Germany, we wonder, how could this have happened? But you have to realize it can happen in any generation where, it's like the frog in the kettle, and the temperature just rises slowly, and we just get adjusted to it. Temperature rises slowly. We just get adjusted to it. So it can happen in any generation. We have to be on our guard, on our watch, Because anywhere where there is disaffected people, anywhere where there is a mindset of scarcity, you start to move towards elitism, you start to move towards the pyramid of power, you start to move towards prejudice. So it's like that in the Roman world. And the status quo was only those who deserve power and wealth should get power and wealth. And so you had certain practices in the ancient world. Let me mention a couple. One was infant exposure. And the idea was that if you had a baby, and it was a girl who was less economically valuable, culturally valuable, socially valuable, or if you had a child that had a disability, had a deformity, you would take it out to a garbage heap or take it out to the wilderness and you leave it to die. Now, let's say 50% of the time the baby would die. 50% of the time there would be kind of poachers who would come by and take that child into slavery, and turn a profit. This was the status quo. This was normal, right? Have you ever seen videos from the 1970s or 80s, their documentaries or their commercials where seatbelts were first introduced into American
I
society,
remember
and
that.
people are like,
Yes.
I don't want to wear a seatbelt. It's going to hamper or there was one about like prohibiting drinking and driving. They're like, after work, I just want to kick back a beer. Now we're shocked, right? We're
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, you're not wearing a seatbelt. That's crazy.
Yes. Children in the front
But,
seat. Yeah.
but it wasn't crazy 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we know how this could happen. So infant exposure, the other one is slavery. The notion that you bought and sold people like you do a car today, or like you do livestock if you're a farmer. You bought and sold people. And this was extremely normal. I just watched Gladiator 2, got
Hmm.
a good dose of nostalgia there from my youth. And a lot of it is realistic that you buy and sell people for entertainment. And these Christians come along, and if today we have the notion of the inherent equality and dignity of the individual, it was really Jesus as a Jewish person, but also as the Son of God Messiah. And then the early church saying neither Jew nor Gentile, slave or free, and in other places, rich or poor, high class, low class, talking about the inherent dignity. This is a cool story that I talk about in my book. There was a kind of deputized leader of the emperor, Pliny, who was sent to investigate Christians and report back to the emperor. And he does so. And he happened to interrogate two Christians. And just by chance, the three things we know about them is that they were women. So just statistically, that's interesting. They were slaves. Again, statistically, that's interesting. And they were deacons. So that itself is an oddity in the Roman world.
Yeah.
Women were not seen as valuable as men. Certainly, slaves were not seen as valuable as free people. And then deacons, the term deacon means servant. So what we learn about Christianity is this is a whole different way of thinking about the world.
Yeah.
And so when we approach our work, when we approach a church, when we approach a Christian business, a Christian institute, are we operating from just let's Christianize the world a little, let's Christianize worldly things just a little bit, just sprinkle some, some chocolate
Holy water on
sprinkles or
it. Yeah.
something, on it to make it a little more Christian? Or are we just starting from scratch and saying, what are the things of Jesus? And how do we
Yeah.
build our church, our ministry, our leadership from the bottom up? Now, the reason I think this is a problem is I feel like the church right now in America is going through a reckoning. Scandals, financial, sexual abuse. It's gut-wrenching. But we Christian leaders have to look this square in the eye and say, this is happening under our watch.
Yeah.
Some of this has been happening for decades. Hidden. Look what happened with Church of England and some of the things that were going on there with the Archbishop
Yeah.
stepping down. It's happening in America all over the place. We have to say these are signs of what I call shadow Christianity. So shadow Christianity is something that calls itself Christian, but actually lives out the opposite.
Hmm.
So Paul says in Philippians 3, you have these people that claim to be Christians, but they revel in evil. Their glory is actually shame. Their God is their belly, meaning their
Hmm.
sinful appetites.
Yes.
And he's talking about Christians. He's
Yeah.
talking about Christian leaders. And so this is the right time to say
Yeah.
we always have to go back to the beginning, ad fontes. This is what the reformers did. They said we have to scrape off any layers and gook that have accrued on our faith, and let's go back to the beginning and
Go
say, let's just
back.
start from the very beginning bricks
I love it.
and build it from the bottom, saying humility, equality, generosity, spirit empowerment,
Yeah.
hope. Let's go back to the beginning. And I don't think, again, they did everything right, but they give us the first formula, and we need to pay attention.
So good. Well, Nijay teaches at Northern Seminary. You can find his books online and also his Substack, nijkgupta.substack.com. There's also a cool magazine called Fathom that includes stories from strange religion. What did you call it? Strange Encounters?
Strange encounter.
Check it out. So grateful for you. Keep up the amazing work. Thanks for challenging and encouraging us today.
My pleasure. Just in case you're interested, I have a book called The Affections of Christ Jesus, Love at the Heart of Paul's Theology. And that is kind of a spin-off of Strange Religion, where I really focus on love as the heart of our theology.
Beautiful. We'd love to get a hands on that too. Thank you so much, Nijay.
My pleasure. Good talking to you.
Thanks for joining us for the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast. Go to my website, ericbryant.org, for my newsletter and free resources.